that we'll come to in our time together. You should have just a one-page handout. I think there's a little bit printed on the back of that page, but just a one-page handout today. So we're going to try to deal with the subject of archaeology in the Bible. Before we do that, I want to do two things. I want to read this text, and then I would like to begin with prayer. The text that I'm reading is kind of an unusual text, but it's going to be related to one of the comments I'm going to be making later in this in our time together. I'm reading from the book of 2 Kings, and I'm going to read starting in verse 1, and I'll read just the first 6 verses. 2 Kings chapter 17. This is, in order to set the context, this is a text that is describing the divided kingdom, and especially the 10 northern tribes up in Samaria. It's the 10 northern tribes at the very end of their existence, and in fact, at the point where they collapse and are demolished by the Assyrian Empire. That will be in these few verses. In any event, let me read it. Thank you, Dan. Thank you for doing this.
I don't know if I gave you your original.
Okay.
You probably know where you're going.
Thank you. All right, let me begin with 2 Kings 17:1. The text says, "In the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea the son of Elah began to reign in Samaria over Israel, and he reigned for 9 years. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, yet not as the kings of Israel who were before him. Against him came up Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, and Hoshea became his vassal, and he paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria found treachery in Hosea, for he had sent messengers to So," that is the name of a Pharaoh's, sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year in the past. Therefore, the king of Assyria came and shut him up and bound him in prison. Then the king of Assyria invaded all the land, and he came to Samaria, and for 3 years he besieged it. In the 9th year of Hoshea, 3 years later, at the end of the 3 years, in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he carried the Israelites away to Assyria, and he placed them at various places that are mentioned in the deportation. So we'll come back to that text, but a little later this morning, if we may. Let me lead us in prayer. Lord, I thank you for your word. Thank you for how we've been able to reflect on your word already today. Thank you for the blessing and the illumination and the challenge that Pastor Todd was able to, how he was able to use your word today in such remarkable ways to describe the grief and the pain and the wrath that you went through for us. It is so easy for us almost to be glib as we use those kinds of words to try to understand what it is that you have done for us. All we can say, Lord, is that we are profoundly grateful. We know that you didn't do it for yourself, you did it for us. And you didn't go halfway, you went entirely. And you didn't give up until the job was finished. And we thank you that it is finished. I ask that you would enable us today to focus on this subject and equip ourselves better and to be more useful in your service and in your ministry. I pray in Jesus' name, amen. Amen. I want to talk about this subject of archaeology in the Bible, but I think for me it's necessary to try to help set the stage for that. In other words, the question might come up, why should we even talk about that subject? And how can we know that it's really that useful? That would be a debatable subject, be worthy of consideration, but for me, it's helpful to think in terms of analogies. At least it's helpful for me. So let me describe 2 analogies that I think help us better to say to ourselves, this is why we ought to be thinking about archaeology in the Bible. Just in the last couple of months, I was reading a book that was actually a translation of a book that was originally done in the Latin language. And this was a person who wrote probably about the 3rd century AD, and he was invited to write a book by no less than the Roman Caesar. The Roman Caesar said, in effect, if I have got legions of men, and they had at least 25 legions scattered all throughout the Roman Empire. But there came a day when the Caesar said to himself, and eventually to this person, if we're going to be conducting war all over the Roman world, I need to have what amounts to a military manual. I need to know how we should conduct war. How should we really do it when we're on water? How should we do it when we're on land? How far should we stretch our troops? In other words, all of the, or at least many of the issues that would be related in the tactics and the strategy of conducting war. And this fellow, this man, doesn't matter his name, he was instructed to write this manual. And it's actually a considerable, when you translate it, it translates today into about 300 pages of English. But at this point now, I'm going to refer to the man who was the translator, a man who was living in the 20th century at the point that he translated this. And in his preface, this is what he said about trying to understand more of what this author was saying. He said, it is only, I'm paraphrasing now, he said, it is only by trying to understand what these words would have originally meant when they were given to the Caesar that we can hope to translate them into our language in a way that communicates essentially the same message to us. We can't begin by saying, what does this mean to me? We end there. What we have to do is begin, this author was contending, if my translation is worth anything, I have to determine what these words meant to the man to whom they were originally intended. If my translation is going to be accurate, I first have to figure out what did these words mean to the Caesar. And then figuring out what they meant to the Caesar, I'll try to put them into complementary, similar English words. You understand what this guy was saying? It's what would happen in any kind of translation. I'm sure you guys listen to various TV programs or news programs or whatever it is, and the subject of the Supreme Court often comes up, or the subject of law comes up. And very often you will hear people talking about what did the framers of the institution of the Constitution, what did the framers mean? Or sometimes you hear the expression, how did Jefferson understand this? What did this mean to Jefferson? You understand the kinds of things I'm talking about? That's the very same concept that was going on when this man was trying to translate a piece of Latin into English. It's almost immaterial what it means today, or how it's interpreted today. It's true, the Constitution has to be interpreted today, and maybe sometimes you agree with the interpretation, maybe sometimes you don't, but what I'm trying to get at is, whatever interpretation comes out of it, that's the end of the process. The beginning of the process is to say, what did it mean to the guy who wrote it? What did it mean to Jefferson? What did it mean to the framers? Or, in the case of Roman war, what did it mean to the guy who was charged to do this task by the Caesar? You start with the beginning of the process, not with the end of the process. Yes, you understand what I'm... Sometimes we get it a little wrong today. I probably shouldn't go here. I'll get into trouble when I get home, if not before. But sometimes today, I think we get it a little wrong in the process. We open up our Bibles, and the first thing we want to do is say, what does it mean to me? What does it mean to you? What does it mean? We can go around the room, and if you will allow me, if you will pardon me for saying this, sometimes all we're doing is sharing ignorance. The process should begin with the beginning and move towards the end. We're at the end. That's one of the reasons why archaeology is a very useful tool in trying to understand the Bible. If we're trying to figure out what a biblical text meant, what a biblical author meant when he was writing this, that, and the other, we have to try to get inside that person's mind and say, what did it mean to him? Unless or until we can figure out what that meant, what those words meant to the person who was speaking them or writing them, we have very little hope of trying to translate it into an analogous reality today. One of the ways in which we can take quantum leaps forward in the process of discovering what biblical authors meant is to be able to step out of our world and step into their world. We can't figure out what they meant when we're standing in our world. We sometimes can't figure out what they meant when we're standing in their world. But we have a lot better chance if we can stand flat-footedly in their world, in that world, and understand to the best of our ability, what do these words, what does this episode, what does such an event, what would it have meant in that world? And not the only means, but one of the ways that we have the privilege of being able to do that is to use the devices of archaeology. Archaeology, so to speak, enables us in our minds to be transported out of our world and into the world of the Bible. If archaeology is coming from that world, then it is yet another witness that tells us about various realities in that world. And to the degree that we can get a handle on more and more reality of that world, the better we understand that world. And it just stands to reason that that means we ought to be able to come to the point where we can grasp more fully, maybe more accurately, perhaps even more profoundly, revelation that comes to us. Now, there is an alternative, of course. Everyone sign up to become a student at Trinity, and you start by taking the languages in which the Bible was written. I mean, people say to me, Barry, well, what's the best translation? And my answer to that is, well, for the Old Testament, I kind of prefer the Hebrew translation of the Old Testament. I don't think you can beat it. Okay, you know what I'm trying to say. Okay, so archaeology. It should enable us to unlock doors of understanding, to take steps further backwards, that is, to come closer to the world of biblical reality, to the writers of that reality, and to their understanding of that world. Okay, so that's why, in my mind, we should even spend an hour and 15 minutes or whatever it is that we spend today on the subject of archaeology in the Bible. So having said that now, let's go through this. Very quickly, let me tick off the fact that while on the one hand it is a legitimate avenue to approach the biblical world, you can already imagine how little of that world survives, even in the best of terms. I mean, just consider how much of your world is thrown out every week on garbage day. And how little of your world you can even recall a year from now. Conversations, circumstances, events. Just even in your mind, think through what has gone on even materially in your world the last 7 days. And how much of that will be known even by you a month from now. Not to say a year from now, a decade. You understand what I mean? It's going to be a very small fraction. And what I've said here, and these are not my figures, I can illustrate these figures, but in fact, these figures don't even necessarily come from the biblical world. They come from the ancient world. How much of the ancient world can we expect even to have survived? The estimate that I have read is somewhere between 5 and 10%. In other words, maybe 90% of that world is gone. It hasn't even survived. We know, for example, that people who are specialists in Egyptian tell us that they figured that there probably were millions of yards of papyrus that were used to paint signs and text and so forth. Actually, the estimate is maybe even tens of millions of yards of papyrus. How much do we actually have today? Not even 100 yards. In fact, not even 50 yards. In fact, it's right at 25 yards. In other words, it ain't very much. We know, for example, that Roman soldiers were paid regularly. We have written texts that we know how much they made and so forth, and how often they were paid, and we know how many of them there were. About 100 years after Jesus, at the point that the Roman Empire, the Roman Empire was at its apex, there were legions. There were probably as many as 25 legions of Roman soldiers sent to various places in 3 different continents, and the estimate is that there were probably about 5,000, maybe as many as 6,000 legionnaires in each one of those legions, and there were so you can do the math. And they were paid, and not only were they paid, they were given a receipt for their payment. We know that because we have literature that describes that. So there are mathematicians who have sat down and have said, how many years was Rome paying the legionnaires? How many legionnaires were there? How regularly were they paid? This times this times this. So how many pay vouchers would have existed in the Roman world? People who have done that, their estimate is over 100 million. Actually, the figure I have here in front of me is 112.5 million pay vouchers. How many do we have today? If my information is correct and complete, 6. So that's a good deal more than 90% loss. We know from Josephus, the Jewish historian, that in his lifetime, and he's basically living just after the time of Jesus, between the time of Jesus and when Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. Actually, he lives as long as John, when John was writing the Revelation, about 90. So Josephus lived on. But anyhow, he tells us in his writing, and there's no reason to doubt Josephus at this point, that there were 70 Jewish synagogues. There were 70 first century Jewish synagogues in Israel. How many of those do you think survive today? 1 that we know for sure was in his count. So the point that I'm trying to make is there's just a fraction of stuff. I mean, one could extrapolate in other areas. I've just picked a few. So only a fraction of what existed then has even survived. Of that which has survived, how much has been surveyed? The estimate of others that I'm using here is 10%. Now I can illustrate that in this way. People who should be in the know tell us that there are about 5,000 archaeological tells, archaeological places, towns, whatever, about 5,000 of them in Palestine. Fewer than 300 have been surveyed. In Iraq, the number is about 6,000. There have been 30 major excavations. In Egypt, the work has been restricted largely to tombs, pyramids, temples, and the like. We don't have a single tell. We have one tell. We do have what is called Tel El Amarna, but it's not a tell. Okay. Turkey has not even yet been systematically surveyed. So we don't even know how many places, how many towns, how many spots people were living in, although there are quite a few. At this point, if my information is still up to date, there have only ever been 12 major excavations inside modern Turkey. And so forth in Syria, it's the same thing. You've got a few thousand, but only a few. In other words, even what has survived there's been only a small fraction of that that has been surveyed and excavated. And then of that, you'll notice, then of what has actually been unearthed from the ground, how much of what has been exhumed has been published. The estimate there is 10 to 25%. If I were writing those estimates, I would be more inclined to go with the 10% than with the 25%. Just as an illustration, when I was writing my dissertation on a major archive in Syria, all of the people who did the work said that we had discovered, we figure, somewhere in the neighborhood of 25,000 pieces of writing. And I was trying to get my hands on every piece of writing that came from that site. And I spent more than a little time trying to do that. And I ended up with somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 of those. So how valid is the story that I told? I mean, I'm sure it was told in a perfect sort of way. But a lot of the words are left out. We could play a game this morning where I said, and you fill in the blank. 'Twas the night before. No. You all do this yourself. We know the story. We know that story. But if we didn't know that story, and I started out by saying, 'twas the night before, you fill in the blank, and all through not a creature was, not even we'd have more stories than we have people in the room. And even then, we had 3/4 of the information. 'Twas the night before, you just have to fill in one. You understand what I'm trying to say? It's a fragmentary sort of thing. Now, that doesn't mean that what we have is insignificant or trivial. But we have to bear in mind that even with what we have, the story is much, much greater than that. This is no panacea. This is no answer at all. This may allow us to step a few steps closer to the biblical events. But archaeology is no panacea, because even if we knew everything that has been published, all we've got are a few snippets and pieces from a vast, I mean, again, the people who run the numbers, statisticians who run these numbers, I have a friend who teaches at MIT. He uses these figures and he says, and therefore, what we have today is 1/25,000th of what existed, using these numbers. So I would say this, that there's an important outcome from that. It's an expression that sometimes is used and should be used, and it is this: absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The so-called logical fallacy, it's one of the fallacies in books. People write books on terms of logical fallacies, and this would be what is called the fallacy of the negative evidence. That is to say, if you don't have evidence for something, then it must never have happened. We don't have evidence that the town of Jericho actually was being occupied at the time that the Bible says the walls fell down flat. Absolutely no evidence from an archaeological point of view that the place was even occupied, much less that the walls fell. Does that mean the event didn't happen? That would be an example of absence of evidence becoming evidence of absence. The logical fallacy says absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Now, if you could go to Jericho and you could pick up a text, you actually dig around in the dirt there a little bit. Those of you who are going with me, you might try this. You find a tablet and you pick it up, and that text says, Joshua was never here. Now you have positive evidence. Right? Now it's not the fallacy of the negative evidence. Now you've got positive evidence. Now we can say, we've got a real problem. You understand? It's just a small fraction of what. But in any event, what we possess, though, what has survived, is actually worthwhile and helpful and useful. And so may I talk a little bit about what I think the evidence of archaeology can and cannot do. I've listed about 7 things that I think it can do, and all I can do this morning is just more or less just tick off these points and maybe illustrate in one way or another. It assists in ascertaining the exact text of the biblical authors. Now, there are just a few words there, but those words are really powerful. The oldest complete Hebrew Bible that we have. The Hebrew Bible, if I brought my Hebrew Bible in here, if you came down to Trinity and studied Hebrew, you would have to buy a Hebrew Bible and so forth. The manuscript from which that Bible derives dates to the year 1008 AD. It's just a little bit more than 1,000 years old. It's as close to Jesus in time as it is you and me. And it's much further away from David than it is from you and me. And Abraham, you can't even see him. He's way back in the dust. But as a result of finding, and the story is not a great deal better in the New Testament. Of course, we know that events in the New Testament, all of them transpired in the 1st century AD. But the Greek Bible that Grant Osborne or other guys like that use, that Greek Bible comes from either the, let's say, the late 4th century AD or the early 5th century AD. There's a gap, and that chronological gap, I would say, is considerable when we're dealing with the Old Testament. It's not unremarkable when dealing with the New Testament. It's worth adding to the consideration here. But the point is, if we're trying to figure out what a biblical writer meant, the closer in time we can get to when that biblical writer wrote, it stands to reason. The better we're able to, the more sure we can be that what we have in our Bibles accurately reflects what that person originally wrote or thought. Now, what can archaeology do here? Well, for example, in the Old Testament, in the middle of the 20th century, not until the middle of the 20th century, around 1947, 1948, was when the process that we call the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls began. And it went on there for about maybe 8 or 10 years. And so today, there's a vast, really a vast body of pieces, snippets of text and actual scrolls that include writings of this sect called the Essenes. It talks about how they lived, what they thought, how they buried people, how they lived, how they ate, and so forth. So in other words, there's a lot of secular literature there, but in addition to that, there's biblical literature. And as a matter of fact, every Old Testament book in the Old Testament is attested there, except for the book of Esther. That's the only book that is not found there. Who knows why? Maybe that's just a fluke. I know people will give you an answer, but the answer is we don't know. What we can say is that of the 39 books of the Old Testament, 38 of them are attested there at the Dead Sea, what is called the site of Qumran. And some biblical texts, Old Testament texts, are attested frequently. If you take, for example, you take a look at the New Testament. Where does the New Testament quote the Old Testament? There are about 150 quotations of the Old Testament in the New Testament. You understand what I'm trying to say? And where in the Old Testament do those 150 come from? You'll find that there are 3 books that are most frequently quoted by this or that writer of the New Testament. The book of Deuteronomy, the book of Psalms, and the book of Isaiah. As it turns out, those are the same 3 books that are most commonly found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In other words, we have more manuscripts of those 3 books. In other words, it's pretty clear then that those books, because they're being cited more, it's not that, those books were featured in first century Awana groups. It's not that what they memorize. In other words, there's an idea that is revolving around that those books contain material that very much related to the first century world. In the New Testament, voila, here's the first century world outside of the New Testament. So it stands to reason. Now, some of those Old Testament books, not all of them, not even half of them, but some of them we have scrolls or manuscripts that can be unfolded, and you have the entire book. The best example, of course, is the entire book of Isaiah. Isaiah is not the biggest book. Psalms, of course, would be the longest book, have the most verses and so forth. But Isaiah ranks up there. It's in the top 5, yeah, in terms of length. And at the Dead Sea, 2 relatively complete scrolls of the book of Isaiah have been found at 2 different places, but right there at the Dead Sea. And one of those 2 contains portions of and most of all 66 chapters of the book of Isaiah. In other words, I'm guessing now. Never really thought of it this way before. I would guess that probably 98%, certainly more than, well, yes, probably more like 99% of all of the words in the Hebrew Bible in the book of Isaiah that I could bring to you today are also found there in that. In other words, it's a very complete text. And so complete is it that people sit and go through those 2 texts. In other words, the book of Isaiah, as it is found there at the Dead Sea, and the book of Isaiah, as it is found in our Hebrew Bible, go through those things chapter by chapter, verse by verse, word for word, letter for letter inside each word, and they have done that. I've done that a little bit, but there's a man who's now deceased, who was, when he was doing his work, was a professor of biblical studies at Yale University, and who has written, I think, what is still the best book on that subject. And he's not an evangelical. I believe he was Christian. In other words, I don't think he was Jewish. I think his religious affiliation was mainline Protestant. And this is Miller Burroughs' conclusion to the difference between those 2 texts, which, by the way, are separated by more than 1,200 years. Isaiah, as found in our Hebrew Bible, I said, was just about 1000 AD. Isaiah at the Dead Sea is, we think, probably about 200 and maybe even as early as 250 BC. Miller Burroughs says, the difference between those 2 texts is the difference, I'm virtually quoting Burroughs now. The difference between those 2 texts is the difference between spelling the word honor, H-O-N-O-R, or H-O-N-O-U-R. End quote, Miller Burroughs. In other words, it's pretty close. Very close. And as a result of that discovery, we can take a quantum leap backwards in time and go more than a millennium in time closer to when Isaiah wrote. We're far closer to Isaiah today as a result of an archaeological discovery, accidental to be sure, but then many of them are, than we would otherwise be. That's a great help. It's a help in several ways. Number one, it means that even with 1,200 years in between, there were no major blunders. Same language. I mean, just this week, I had the opportunity of being at a Christian publisher where they have a big page of the King James Bible in 1611. Okay, a page from the actual 1611. And I've done this before, but I played with this again because it was another page out of the Bible. This one happened to be from the book of Ezekiel. And I read that and I thought to myself, you know, I recognize that as the Bible, but I'm not, and I'm pretty sure this is English. But it ain't what I have in my Bible in English. In other words, it's only 500 years old, yeah? 1611 until now? Well, no, 400 years old. That makes my story even more grand. Not as much time. I said, the English language has just changed almost immeasurably in those 400 years. If you would apply that same sort of change over a 1200-year period between this Hebrew text and this Hebrew text, the earlier one may not even be discernible as a representation of the first. It means we can go so much closer to the biblical time. Now, I said in the New Testament it's not as great, but even there's been some dramatic discoveries. There are papyri that are found. You can find them today in London. You can go to Dublin. You can go to Egypt, and you can find actual papyri of parts of the New Testament. And some of them, I have, for example, what is called the John Rylands Papyrus, which is a section of the Gospel of John. People who work in Greek say that this is dated to AD 135. 135. John probably wrote about 60. At least that's what New Testament scholars believe. He wrote before the city of Jerusalem was destroyed, but after the events. So in other words, what that means to me is that that papyrus of John that is found in the British Museum today may be the textual grandchild, or probably not more than the great-grandchild of the piece that John wrote. There's a Bodmer papyrus that includes Luke, John, Jude, and almost all of 1st and 2nd Peter that is found in Egypt today and is dated by people who do that work. Their dates somewhere between 175 and 225 AD. So once again, you see, that, and now you're talking about almost all of 5 New Testament books. The Chester Beatty Papyrus contains much of the Gospels, Acts, much of Paul, and the entire book of the Revelation. And it dates by people who do that work there. It's their dates, not mine, roughly AD 200. So in other words, if we just forgot about the Old Testament for a bit and just dealt with the New Testament, before archaeology, we're roughly 450 years separated textually between John and the Gospel of John, the earliest Gospel of John. We've just stepped about halfway there, and maybe a little bit more in the case. In other words, archaeology assists in ascertaining the exact text of the biblical authors, and that is not inconsequential. Secondly, it attests to individual words used sparsely in the Bible. I'll just illustrate this with the Old Testament a little bit, if I may. There are only about 8,000 different vocabulary words in the entire Old Testament. But guess what? Of that, it's a very limited vocabulary. Shakespeare uses 25,000 words. Chaucer uses, I'm told, over 30,000 words. 30,000 different vocabulary words, not words, but different vocabulary words. So 8,000 is a limited use of vocabulary. But of those 8,000 words, how many of those 8,000 words do you imagine occur only one time in our Old Testament? Take a guess. I mean, I know I'm setting you up. I shouldn't, it's not fair. I won't set you up. We don't know the answer exactly, but I can tell you what the scholarly range is. Somewhere between 1,200 and 1,400 of those words. Between 1,200 and 1,400 of those vocabulary words, when you have a body of vocabulary that is limited to 8,000 words, you're talking about a lot of guesswork. How do you figure out what a word means when you only have it one time? And about 1/3 of those occur in the book of Job. Man, talk about it. That's the hardest. When I was a student at Fuller Seminary, the school always offered a course. Every term they offered a course, rapid Hebrew reading rapid Hebrew reading in Joshua, rapid Hebrew reading in Isaiah, whatever it would be. And the prof, whoever was going to teach the course, would just decide, okay, for this term, I want to do Deuteronomy, and so they would fill it in, whatever was the choice of the professor. And I took as many of those as I could take. And I mean, it really was rapid Hebrew reading. We didn't talk about what this meant. We were just trying to read it. So maybe we read 6, 8, 10 pages in an hour. You can't do, I mean, even in English, I'm only allowed to assign 20 pages an hour. And it's the language of, it's our native language. Okay. So one semester, Prof signed up for Job. I have no idea what was going through his mind. And he said, he confessed to us later. He said, it was about a month before the course was starting. And I thought, you know what, I haven't read in Job for a long time, and I've got this rapid. I better sit down and start working. I better brush up my Job. He opens up and starts reading. And he said, after about 20 minutes of reading, he closed his Bible. And he said, at that point, I felt the best thing for me to do was to pray that no one would sign up for the course. And I did not sign up for that one. As a matter of fact, his prayer was answered. No one signed up for that because Job is really, really tough. And it's tough because there are several hundred words that are used in Job one time and no place outside of it. How do you figure out what a word means when it's used only one time? Okay, I'll say this to my wife. I don't want to get into trouble. If I said to her, I'm going to try, give me a word that is not a word. There's no English word for it.
Supercalifragilistic.
What is it?
Ikaloo.
Ikaloo?
Mm-hmm.
Was that
Yeah.
Ikaloo? Okay, now if I walked up to her and I said, I'm going to Ikaloo you. You tell me what I mean. You know what I mean? How can you figure out what a word means when it's only used one time?
Right.
And we've got more than 1,000 of these things. All of a sudden, voila, as a result of archaeology, texts from that world that are unearthed attest to many of the same vocabulary words. Not all of them, probably not even half of them, but to many of them. And that, I would argue, is why we have so many new versions of the Bible in the 20th century. It's not that Bible publishers are trying to get their piece of the pie. Oh, who knows? Maybe some of them are. It is that all of a sudden we sit on a lot more information that allows us to understand what that word meant. And if I had time here, I could show you how Bible translation has changed, how the actual translation of a given text has changed a good bit in certain books as a result of that one fact. It's another way of getting closer to the biblical text. Okay, it enables us to understand the world of which the Bible was a part. I mean, the explosion of information is hard, I think it's hard to fathom. Around the time of the Civil War, almost exactly at the time of the Civil War, the British Museum, one of the leading museums in the world, had a showcase of Middle Eastern archaeological finds. One window, 4 feet square. It was displaying what the British Museum had archaeologically from the Middle East as late as the time of the American Civil War. You go to the British Museum today and you walk across acres, and if you want to walk some steps or take an elevator, you go through various floors. Talk about an explosion. In about 150 years, from one 4-foot case to 5 or 6 acres. And that is, I would say, 90% as a result of what has come out of the ground through the enterprise of archaeology that includes the enterprise of biblical archaeology. It's fairly significant. It does away with many erratic theories and unfounded theories. I won't pick on anyone. I won't even pick on necessarily evangelical erratic theories, but I think it does do away with some what I think are evangelical erratic theories. But let me pick on one that's not an evangelical one. There's a very famous professor at it's 2 generations ago. He published between the First and the Second World War. So he's long since left this world. And he was an established authority it wasn't Ohio State, but I can't think, it doesn't matter. It was some major university in the state of Ohio. And he was an anthropologist. And he says this, this is not a direct verbatim quotation, but I'll give you the gist of it. He said, I can more easily imagine that the sun would rise in the west and set in the east than I could imagine a society in antiquity that would not have passed from a nomadic status to a semi-nomadic status to a sedentary status. In other words, it's a one-way kind of evolution. And I know this one is normally chanted because of who said it and how boldly he said it. Well, we can effectively do away with that. We can show archaeologically that A, that not everyone passed through those 3 steps. B, we can show how many of those steps were coexisting together at the same time. This is very useful, let's say, as early as the book of Genesis, where you've got a migratory sort of status in the book of Genesis. I mean, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their wives and their families, they don't really have a home. They're moving they have flocks, they have herds, they're moving from place to place. Well, but the point is then they're coming into contact with towns. And I'm sure this guy from Ohio is saying, well, okay, the reason we know that is true is because those narratives, therefore, must have been written as late as when people were sedentary and were living in towns. It couldn't have been written early because you can't have people who are migrating at the same time you have people who build cities. You understand what I'm trying? We can simply dispose of that. He would probably be the first person. If he were still alive today, in light of the evidence that has been on earth since he wrote that, he would probably be the first person. He would probably be very embarrassed and probably be the first person to say, how did that kind of an idea get into my head? I mean, I think we know probably because of Charles Darwin, but we won't go there. It supplements our knowledge of the Bible and the biblical world. Oh, we know much more about law in the Bible, about social practices, about prophetic literature, about language, about events. Okay, it helps, then I said here, it helps illustrate the Bible. In other words, oftentimes today, because we don't understand that world, people get the wrong idea about some of the Old Testament. I'll give you 2 examples. One is there's a big chunk of the part of the Old Testament that is very bloody. And in the 21st century, that's very politically incorrect. And it turns people off, and they don't want to read about that. And so, but I don't think they're consciously doing this. But in effect, what they're doing is saying, because those things are nasty to talk about today, they were nasty to talk about when they were written, it was inappropriate. So in other words, what they're saying is, I'm going to use my 21st century standard of what is right and wrong to say what is right and wrong about the Bible. By the way, that same thing could be applied to certain forms of morality and ethics. You find behavior in the Bible that would be altogether improper and wrong today. I'll give you one illustration. Think way back to Genesis when Sarah, not being able to birth a son, proposes that Hagar and so forth. Now, if we were to, if someone were to try that story on you today, you'd say, yeah, sure. Yet in the Old Testament, we have archaeological evidence that shows us that outside of the Bible, other, what I will call sterile women, maybe that's not the right word. Is that the right word to use? A woman who, for whatever reason, cannot get pregnant. That's what we're trying to say there. and because of the social enigma, even the marital status that was called into question, also proposed to their husbands that they accomplish, that is, the wife accomplishes her marital commitment in that society by providing to her husband a male offspring.
We're coming back to it, though. It's,
1800,
we're
yeah.
circling.
Is that what you're asking?
No, I'm saying give us another 5 years. We're kind of coming back to
Oh,
that.
yeah, maybe we are, I don't know. Now, there is not one sentence, there is not one word, one sentence of biblical censure found in Genesis or any place else. There is no place where we can go in our Bible to say Abraham was wrong in doing this. It would be wrong for us. And I've heard in a number of stories in the 20th century, well, Abraham was moving ahead of God and so forth. That's retrojecting today's morality back upon the biblical text. It's not right. We've got to allow that biblical text to stand on its own within that world. When we think of an event like that, we think of sex on the side. Nothing could be further from that text. If that's what Abraham wanted, he didn't need his wife's suggestion. Sure, she's probably motivated at that point because she sees that her own status as wife is in danger, because the marriage contracts that we have outside of the Bible not only lay the onus squarely and exclusively upon the woman, but oftentimes those marriage contracts give the woman a certain amount of time in which to provide that son. I've seen 2 years, 5 years, 7 years. There are hundreds of marriage contracts that we have found from outside of the Bible, and there are a few dozen where this actually is stipulated. And we know that Abraham and Sarah were married a minimum of 10 years at Genesis 16, where she makes that proposal. Perhaps they were married longer than that. Probably they were married longer than that. But even if they only got married the same year that he left Haran at the call of God, it's now 10 years later. Well, that might strike us as foreign and strange. And as a matter of fact, from a societal point of view, it is foreign and strange. But we have to understand that it's necessary for us to read the Bible in its culture, not in our culture. Oh, another place, another area in the Old Testament that people can't digest, and that is genealogies. What in the world? We don't do, unless we're Seventh-day Adventists today, unless we're Mormons today. You go to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. and go to genealogies and see that there are whole banks of books of genealogy on the history of Mormonism. But unless we're Mormons, genealogy doesn't make that much difference. It's almost undemocratic, where we talk about the individuality, pulling ourselves up by our boots. And so when people come to reading genealogies, they say, why is this in the Bible? I'm 20 pages beyond the genealogy. Oh, this is scripture. Now I'm going to read it. Amazing how much data in ancient texts from outside of the Bible deals precisely with genealogies. The Bible is very much a reflection of its own world. It's not the way in which we're going to do it. If we're going to write the history of America, I bet you none of us in the room knows the first name of the father of George Washington. Now watch, there will be some. The history of America doesn't flow out of the genealogies of the big guys. Not so in the ancient world. It was a way of demonstrating blue-bloodedness, of purity, and the like. And there are some stories, even in the Old Testament, where, because a person cannot provide their genealogy, for example, at the end of the 70 years of captivity, according to the book of Ezra, chapter 2, and that would be paralleled with Nehemiah chapter 7, there were some people who wanted to join that 50,000, who were going to go back, the first group of people who go back. According to Ezra 2, there were other people who wanted to join them so that they could go back, but they couldn't provide their genealogical records. In other words, they couldn't demonstrate that they were blue-blooded, Jewish. And the people said, thanks, but no thanks. You can stay behind. You're not part of the 50,000. We wouldn't do that. Today it would be come one, come all. Whosoever will. Okay, I'm not saying what's right and what's wrong. I'm saying what's different. And we must be careful that we don't become little imperialists. Since it's right today, it always has been right, and it always will be right. Since it's wrong today, it always will be wrong, and it always has been wrong, and it always will be wrong. That's imperializing our Bible. And it's not right. We shouldn't do that. And archaeology helps us to see how much better we can understand the culture of the Bible by getting into that culture. Well, I better go on. There are some actual facts, and here the story would be tremendous. I mean, one could spend the next year just on this subject, but I'm going to give you one. I've reduced it to one illustration, and it's the illustration from the text that I read to you this morning out of 2 Kings. Actually, there are two texts that are related. The one is that 2 Kings 17 text, and if you want to look up, there's another verse that is related to this story, and it's found in the prophecy of Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 20, verse 1. All right, there are two facts that the Bible is telling us. Let me jump to Isaiah first. All right, in Isaiah chapter 20, if you read in Isaiah chapter 20, it's talking about the Assyrian king Sargon, S-A-R-G-O-N. Okay, that is the only time when that name appears in the Old Testament, and that name as a king of Israel appears nowhere else in all of ancient literature. Moreover, 75 years ago, people had found long lists of what are called king lists. Great big long lists, sometimes 75, 100 different kings, and sometimes it not only gives the name of the king, but it may give the length of his reign, or who else was reigning at the same time. They may be synchronistic. Several of these lists. Nowhere on any of those lists is the name Sargon. So if we were having this class about 75 to 100 years ago, this is what I would tell you. Well, the best commentaries on the subject some of them think, well, maybe this wasn't his real name, it wasn't his given name, maybe this was a nickname for somebody else. Or maybe this was the name that his mother gave him, but of course he adopted a royal name, or something like that. Less conservative people argued, don't you see, here's a wonderful case where there's a glaring error in our Bible. We even have king lists that go for, and the guy doesn't appear, never even one time. And then all of a sudden, voila, someone goes to another site in Syria, and as a result of what was discovered on that site, we now realize there's a very good reason why that guy didn't have his name on the king list. As a matter of fact, that guy, Sargon's entire archive was uncovered at another place. We now have the name of Sargon appearing more than 20,000 times in more than 20,000 different pieces of literature. It occurs in Assyrian literature 20,000 times and once in the Bible. But if we were here 75 years ago, it would occur once in the Bible. And it turns out the Bible's right. It's right chronologically. And so the reason that we now say, and I say we, I'm talking, this is not an evangelical talking to you now. This is someone who reads people who know what they're talking about, okay? We know why his name was not in there, because he was viewed as an outsider. He even went to another city to build his capital, and he lived there for whatever. And when he died, they said, "Nuts with that guy. We're going back to the blue bloods, so to speak." And they excised his name. Very much like the reason why King Tut doesn't appear in many of the Egyptian king lists. Oh, does he exist? Of course he exists. We have a whole bunch of stuff. We have probably more that has been found, but he's not even listed on some because he was viewed as an outsider by the guys who were writing the history. He started worshiping another god. What? He must be a cult. Well, in fact, that would have probably have been viewed as a cult-like. So he's not an Orthodox guy. We're going to slice him from our history. Okay, well, anyhow. Okay, so turns out, it looks like Isaiah chapter 20 verse 1 is right. There was a guy named Sargon, and he was a king. All of a sudden, now we've got another problem. We've got 20,000 or so documents from this guy, and now we have a document that tells us something we wish we didn't know. This guy claims that he was the king of Assyria at the time that the 10 northern tribes were taken out. And I turned to 2 Kings 17, and that is reserved for a king named Shalmaneser. Now, by the way, this is stepfather, stepson. Okay? So now we have an Assyrian text that says that Sargon captured the 10 northern tribes. The Bible says that Shalmaneser was king of Assyria. And there, for a time, there lay a new rub. And then, believe it or not, in the last 20 years, a man was going through part of an archive at Yale University. And actually what he was doing was pulling out unpublished texts from the Yale archive and trying to put them together so he could write a dissertation on them. And he was trying to write his dissertation on Sargon, this guy that we've just found. And lo and behold, in the Yale archive text, he found a document that dates the year and the month that Sargon died. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I misspoke there. He found the year and the month that the father, Shalmaneser, died. And as soon as the father died, it's the son's ballgame. Now we know from the Old Testament and from Josephus that the 10 northern tribes were captured by the Assyrian Empire in the month of August, 722 BC. This text tells, that was when it was captured. This text from Yale shows us tells us that Shalmaneser, this same guy, died in December of the year 722 BC. And that he died en route from that campaign. In that campaign, Samaria was killed, but he died somewhere along the way, maybe in Syria, but he died 4 months later. He never got back home, so he never got to ride in the victory parade. So his son just decided he was going to ride in the victory parade. So in other words, today, people would tell you, of all stripes, if they know what they're talking about, guess what? That cuneiform text is wrong when Sargon claims that he was the king. Now, he probably was there at the time, but he wasn't king at the time. He would have been the Joe Biden at the time, okay? And so they would say, you know what? That cuneiform inscription is wrong. The Bible is right. And we're talking about a period that is restricted to a merely 4-month period of time, and it dates almost 3,000 years ago. That's pretty fine historiography. Well, that's the kind of thing that could be multiplied. Well, we won't go there. What it cannot do, I suppose, what I cannot do is finish my outline. Okay, so I'll just deal with this a little bit. What it cannot do, it cannot begin to answer. In fact, it cannot even begin to ask all of the kinds of questions that could be asked. It is no panacea. It cannot answer all problems within the biblical text. It cannot prove the Bible. We must be careful that, earlier I talked about the fallacy of the negative proof. There's an opposite fallacy that is described in the very same book of logic. There's a Brandeis professor who's very well known for logic. And he creates, he has a book, 40 Fallacies of Ancient Historians. And one of his fallacies is the fallacy of the negative proof. Absence of evidence is evidence of absence, yes? Well, evangelicals are fine with that one. Some of us are not so fine with another of his. He also has what he calls the fallacy of the positive proof. Now, a little bit ago I said that there was no evidence. There's no evidence in the conquest that the town of Jericho was occupied at the time. And that's so. But you cannot use that absence of evidence of evidence that the event never happened. All right. Now, I've read in more than one evangelical book, in conjunction with the same series of events in Joshua. Now we know that the fourth of the four battles took place at the city or the town of Hazor. And lo and behold, the archaeological evidence would be that the place was occupied at the time of the conquest. And furthermore, there is overwhelming evidence that the city was destroyed. It burned, maybe parts of it burned to the ground, at the very same time that the Bible says Joshua captured it and burned it. Now we have to be careful that we're not guilty of what I would call, what he calls the fallacy of the positive proof. We've got the right place, we've got the right time, there's burning. We have just proved that Joshua and the boys are responsible for that. You see what I mean? It doesn't prove it at all. All it proves is that the place existed and someone lit a match. Again, what you would really need would be to go there to the city of Hazor, pick up a tablet and says, it was Joshua's matches. Now you have positive proof. You understand what I mean? We have to be careful that there is sufficient latitude and generosity all the way across the stream. Anyhow, it can't prove the Bible. What it can do is illustrate, but it can't prove it. Now I'm just to the point now where I was going to deal with some of the most significant recent discoveries. There are some. That's about all I can say. I don't know what I can say. I'm running out of time here. And next week we're going on to another subject. But now maybe our time would be most profitably spent in 10 minutes if you say to me, what are 3 or 4? Or I've heard that. Or maybe I could respond to, maybe I could scratch where you're itching or something like that. Yeah.
When the Dead Sea Scrolls were in, I believe it was Field Museum, a few years back, several years back. There was some kind of inscription that said in the Hebrew Bible that they did not, Isaiah 53 was not considered a true part of.
Oh, it's there.
It is there.
Oh, sure, it's there.
Okay.
It's there. Isaiah, you'll be able, if you're going along to Israel, if you want to go, you can see the original, not what was down here in Chicago. Well, actually, that's not quite true either. That's not quite true either. You can see a much more authentic original. But the real one is underground at a place where there's no light, no sound, no nothing. It's a treasure. But you'll see a really good quality reproduction there in Jerusalem. What you saw down there is what I would consider to be a fair level quality reproduction, despite the fact that they said it was the original. There's no way the original is ever going to get out of the building where it is right now.
But Isaiah 53
it's
was
beneath
a
the
part
ground,
of it.
in a vault, and so forth and so on.
But Isaiah
53, you'll see Isaiah. If you want to go to Jerusalem, you can see Isaiah 53. It's there. No problem with Isaiah 53. Someone had a hand over here. I thought, yeah.
So David and Solomon didn't make your cut on the list.
Yes, that's correct. You're right. And I have in this book, I have a whole discussion of those 15 people from the Old Testament and why it is that we don't have earlier biblical characters or biblical events recorded in ancient history. It may be the accident of history. I'm inclined to think that it's a consequence of the evidence. And in fact, since you're talking about those two guys in particular, that's the 10th century. I'm going to give you just a few figures now. In the 10th century BC, when the Bible says that David and Solomon were kings in Jerusalem, outside of the Bible, I am familiar with fewer than 12 10th century texts that pertain to Palestine. There is not a single piece of cuneiform literature from either Assyria or Babylonia. There is not a single piece of papyrus from Egypt that relates to the 10th century. About 10, for the most part, short texts. 2 of them are the ABCs. So it's probably some child's exercise. Someone was writing their ABCs, you know, some kid was bad, so his mother sent him out back and said, I want you to, and so he takes a piece of broken pottery, that's a good writing material, and he or she, and they write that 2 of these 10 texts are just the ABCs. One of them is a 6 or 8 line piece of poetry that talks about the time of the year that you plant your crops and the time of the year that you water your crops and the time of the year that you plant. In other words, okay, that's number 3. Number 4, we have no idea what it is. We know where it came from, so we know it can be dated. People can't even read it. And aside from that, you're talking about little teeny snippets of 1, 2 words, in a few cases, maybe 1 or 2 letters, and that is it, brother. That's all we've got for the 10th century. So, yes, I don't know where we would go to find David and Solomon outside of the Bible. Now, David's name is mentioned in the 9th century. 100 years after he lived, there are 2 texts that talk about the house that is the dynasty of David. One of those is in one of those pieces of literature was found in Israel, and today it's in the Jerusalem Museum. The other one was found in modern Jordan, and it's in Paris at the Louvre today. And they mentioned the dynasty of David, but that's different from talking about the person of David. So there's a lot in the 10th. I mean, think what else is going on. The Moabites were there, the Ammonites, the Edomite. We don't know. We don't have a syllable from any of those, from or about any of those people in the 10th century. And yet everyone believes they existed. The fact that we can't attest doesn't mean they didn't exist. It means we don't have all of the evidence. We don't have any evidence. Now, maybe I'm not exactly, am I kind of talking where you're...
Yeah, that was exactly what I was kind of intrigued at. So that was,
do I think David and Solomon existed? The answer is yes. Do I think that Jerusalem was a capital city? Yes. And I have I teach a whole doctoral seminar on Israel in the 10th century. And there is more than a little evidence that something of a political entity existed. Doesn't prove that it was headquartered in Jerusalem, and you could argue that differently. But there was a major political entity, consolidated political entity. And that is represented in massive city walls and massive gates, in dozens of sites and fortresses. Walls around fortresses and so forth. Domestic stuff. We have a 10th century beekeeping event that is estimated to have accommodated 1 million bees, producing possibly as much as 2 tons of honey annually. Well, you know, some Baruch, the son of Halpi, out here in some field is not doing that. It's a state-run industry. And many other things like that. I mean, we have a harbor. Somebody built that harbor. There's an entire metallurgical industry that's going on at 2 different places. Those going on the trip with me, we're going to stop by one of them. The Bible calls it Solomon's Mines. That was a no-no. That was I was criticized for identifying that as Solomon's Mines, the site of Timnah, because the evidence was They weren't even there at that time, and that was true, actually. I mean, the evidence did tend to point in that direction about 20 years ago. I'm now citing information that is less than 6 months old. Publication of two major archaeologists who have led the radiocarbon test on that site. And it came back, and it's unambiguous. It was a metallurgical industry of copper that was being done in the 10th century, not the 9th or the 8th. Now, that doesn't prove it was Solomon. But it does suggest it could have been. And it doesn't rule that out. Anyhow. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Well, do the Egyptians write about capturing Jerusalem under Rehoboam, or
No.
There's
No, they
writing about
don't.
that?
And that's a strange thing. Because in that campaign, we have the Egyptian version of that campaign. And it's a very elaborate version. It's actually more elaborate than what we have in Kings. And in fact, excuse me, on that panel that talks about Shishak's campaign, and Shishak only ever had one campaign. There's only one recorded campaign of Shishak in Egypt. So what's being recorded in Egypt is the very same thing as being recorded there in the Bible. But it doesn't necessarily give his itinerary, but he does list at the bottom, maybe almost around 150 towns that he captured in that campaign. Some of which are also mentioned in the Bible. But the one place that is not mentioned on that list is Jerusalem. Now, at the same time, he doesn't mention Rehoboam, he doesn't mention Jeroboam, and he mentions some of these 10th century forts that I was saying, they exist by the dozens. Well, he goes out of his way to say that he took them out. And there's evidence that they were destroyed in the late 10th century. So, no, it's not. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean? Some of those 150 panels that give the towns, some of them are still empty. In other words, there's no town in there. Some of them there's something written in there, but it's been chipped away or it's obliterated or whatever the case may be. This panel, this big panel that's on part of a temple in Egypt, we can date when this panel was being built. The reason we can date it because Egyptians, there's a text that tell us when the Egyptians quarried the stone that were in that panel. And it was in I think the 9th month, don't hold me to that, of his 20th year. Well, he died in his 21st year. And that's why Egyptian scholars say that's an unfinished panel. Why continue to glorify the guy when he's gone? He's not paying us anymore. So there are some people who say, well, they never got to finish the panel, so maybe Jerusalem was one of those panels that would have been filled in. Maybe yes, maybe no. Maybe I know of a woman at the University of Sheffield who argues that it's possible that one of those partially obliterated panels, she thinks that there's enough there that is a vestige of the word Jerusalem. I frankly don't think, maybe yes, maybe no. I think no. But the point is, there are some explanations for that, but ultimately, I don't think it really matters. The question is, well, I'm over time now, but there's something about those two things. If you want to talk about this when we're done, there is a piece of historiography about those two things that is absolutely remarkable, so remarkable. And I take 90 seconds of your time. Okay, the book of Kings says, not here, but in your Bible, it says that that Shishak had his campaign in the 5th year of Rehoboam. All right, now people who are Old Testament chronologists say that Rehoboam became a king around 929, 930. So the 5th year of his reign would be the year 925, maybe 925, 24. I mean, their years didn't start on January the 1st, but there's a very slight margin of error, yes? All right, that's information that comes exclusively from the Bible. And biblical chronology has absolutely nothing to do with Egyptian chronology. It's another whole ball game. Yeah? All right, so now we go down there to Egypt. And lo and behold, somebody finds an Egyptian text that dates when the slabs for this panel were quarried from the Egyptian quarry to build and it's dated to the 21st year. Well, lo and behold, Egyptian chronologers, their standard, this is their standard. It may vary from year to a year or two. Basically, 945 is the year that they will give to, that's the year when Shishak became pharaoh. 21st year, look at that. In other words, the very same year of this event, as it is dated according to Egyptian sources, is the very same year where this event is dated according to biblical sources. Now, if the one chronology depended on the other or drew from the other, this wouldn't be so powerful. As a matter of fact, it doesn't. There's no relationship between the two. Well, okay, enough said. Enough said. Next week, I'll try to deal with modern politics.
Thanks, Barry.
I'll probably get as far in that as I got today.